All right, ready to dive into some pretty murky waters.
Always up for a challenge.
Today we're tackling the story that's causing like a major storm in the tech world, right? The UK government wants access to Apple users' data, even the encrypted stuff, the things people think are super secure.
Like advanced data protection.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
everything.
We're basing this deep dive mainly on a recent Sky News article, and, well, the implications are huge.
No kidding. It's like a real-world showdown between privacy and security playing out on a global scale.
Okay, so break this down for me. What exactly is the UK government asking for, and why is Apple so against it?
It all comes down to something called a technical capability notice, a TCN.
A TCN.
Yeah, basically a legal order that forces a company to help the government access data, even if it's encrypted.
Okay, but haven't governments asked for data from these companies before? What makes this different?
This TCN is different because of how broad it is. It's not about specific people or investigations. This applies to potentially billions of Apple users worldwide, regardless of whether they've done anything wrong.
So, like,
Imagine the government wants a master key to unlock every safe deposit box in every bank, just in case they need to take a peek.
wow, that's unsettling. So, what's the UK government's reason for wanting this kind of access? They must have a good reason, right?
They say it's about national security, protecting children, and catching criminals. The Sky News article even mentions Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. She specifically called out social media companies,
Yeah.
saying they're not doing enough to stop harmful content, especially in one criminal case.
Right, I can see how that argument would be convincing to some. But wouldn't giving them this kind of access make everyone less safe? Isn't strong encryption important for protecting us from, like, hackers and other bad guys?
That's exactly Apple's point. They're pushing back hard, saying complying with this TCN would make everyone more vulnerable.
How so?
They're saying that even if it's for the right reasons, building a backdoor into encryption is like leaving a universal key under your doormat. Anyone could find it and use it for bad things.
That makes sense. So, if the government can access encrypted data, couldn't cyber criminals or even governments with, let's say, less than ideal human rights records also exploit that access?
Precisely. Apple warns that this would set a dangerous precedent. If the UK wins and forces Apple to break its encryption, what's stopping other countries from demanding the same? It could start a race to the bottom for digital privacy around the world.
So, if Apple's so set on protecting user privacy, is there any middle ground, any way to balance the government's security concerns with the need for individual privacy?
That's the million-dollar question. Experts have been struggling with this for years.
Really?
Oh yeah. Some suggest exceptional access, a system where law enforcement could get encrypted data in very specific limited situations, but only with strict oversight and judicial review. It's a really complex issue, no easy answers.
It does sound like a possible compromise, but even with safeguards, couldn't there still be unintended consequences? And what about the technical side? Can you even make a backdoor to encryption that only the good guys can use?
That's a great point. Making a truly secure backdoor is super difficult, maybe even impossible, technically speaking. And even if you could, there's always a chance someone you're trying to protect against could find and exploit it.
So even if we ignore the ethical and legal side for a minute, the idea of a backdoor just doesn't seem to work practically.
It doesn't, and that's why so many security and privacy experts are against it. They say strong encryption is vital for protecting not just personal data, but also infrastructure, financial systems, national security. Weakening it would make all those things easier to attack.
This is getting complicated. I can see why it's such a big deal. But before we dive deeper into the possible fallout from this TCN, can you give us some background on technical capability notices themselves? How do they work? What laws are they based on? I have to admit, I'm not too familiar with UK surveillance laws.
Right, some context would help.
Hmm.
TCNs are part of a bunch of powers given to UK intelligence agencies under the Investigatory Powers Act, passed in 2016.
Okay.
And that act's been controversial from the start. Critics say it gives the government too much power to, snoop on people without enough oversight.
So this fight over Apple's encryption isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a bigger debate about surveillance, privacy, and the balance of power between governments and tech companies.
Exactly. What happens in this case could have a ripple effect way beyond Apple in the UK. It could set a precedent for digital privacy globally.
High stakes, for sure. But before we get into the potential consequences of this TCN, let's look at Apple's history of resisting these kinds of demands. Haven't they fought with authorities over encryption before?
Oh, they have. Big time. Remember back in 2016 when the FBI tried to make Apple unlock the iPhone of that terrorist from the San Bernardino shooting?
Yeah, vaguely.
Apple refused, said it would compromise the security of all iPhone users. That case started a huge debate about encryption and privacy, and it's still going on.
I remember it being all over the news. So this isn't new territory for Apple. They seem really dedicated to protecting their users' data, even under pressure from governments.
Absolutely, and that's clear in their response to this TCN. Their statement in the Sky News article is powerful stuff. They say this demand would undermine fundamentally human rights and strengthen the hands of malicious actors who seek to steal and exploit personal data for nefarious purposes. They're not backing down.
So Apple's ready for a fight. But what can they actually do? Can they just ignore this TCN? What are their legal options?
Ignoring it isn't really an option. A TCN is a legal order. They have to respond.
Yeah.
But there are ways to challenge it. It's complicated and kind of secretive, but they could appeal to the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. That's an independent body that, oversees the UK's surveillance laws.
So it's not a simple legal battle. There's a lot of unknowns in this whole process. But let's say the UK government wins and forces Apple to comply. What would that actually look like? Would the government have, like, direct access to everyone's iPhone data?
Well, that's where things get tricky technically. See, the government isn't asking for a massive database of everyone's info. What they want is a way to get around Apple's encryption in specific cases. How they'd actually do that is, well, unclear.
Unclear how.
It could mean making a backdoor that lets law enforcement decrypt data on a specific device, or maybe forcing Apple to help decrypt communications live as they happen.
Okay, so even if the government wins legally, there are still major technical hurdles. And like we talked about before, making a secure backdoor is super difficult, if not impossible. Wouldn't that just make everyone's data less secure, not just the people they're investigating?
Exactly. That's the big worry about weakening encryption. It's like trying to make a lock that only the good guys can open.
Hmm.
In reality, any weakness in the system can be used by anyone with the right skills and resources.
So, putting aside the ethical and legal stuff for a second, the whole backdoor idea seems flawed from a practical standpoint, too.
It is. And that's why a lot of security and privacy folks are against it.
Yeah.
They argue strong encryption is crucial for protecting everything. Our personal stuff, infrastructure, financial systems, national security. Weakening it makes all those things more vulnerable.
I'm starting to get it. But how would you explain this to someone who's not, super tech savvy? They might hear the government talk about protecting children and catching criminals and think, yeah, that sounds good. Why not give them the tools they need to keep us safe? How do you explain the risks of weakening encryption to someone who maybe doesn't understand the technical side?
I think it's about emphasizing that this isn't just some abstract tech stuff. It has real-world consequences for everyone online. Think about all the sensitive info on your phone. Banking details, medical records, private messages. Strong encryption helps protect that from prying eyes, whether it's hackers, criminals, or even governments with questionable motives.
So it's not just about keeping your browsing history private. It's about protecting yourself from identity theft, fraud, blackmail, all sorts of bad things.
Absolutely. And it's not just individuals either. Weakening encryption could be devastating for businesses, governments, even whole economies. Imagine hackers getting into sensitive financial data or critical infrastructure systems. The damage would be huge.
It sounds like the stakes are incredibly high. Let's go back to the UK's argument for needing access to this data. They're really focused on protecting children, stopping the spread of child sexual abuse material. Those are serious concerns, right? Shouldn't we do everything we can to protect kids?
Of course, protecting children is absolutely vital, but many experts argue that weakening encryption isn't the best way to do it. In fact, it could even make things worse. Strong encryption actually helps protect kids by making it harder for predators to communicate and share illegal material online. It also protects them from hackers and others who might try to exploit vulnerabilities in their devices or accounts.
So, by trying to fix one problem, we could create new ones. It's a tough situation. But are there other ways to address these concerns about child exploitation online without weakening encryption for everyone?
There are, and a lot of experts are pushing for those alternatives.
Like what?
Things like better training and resources for law enforcement to fight online crime more effectively, stronger international cooperation to catch criminals across borders, and educational programs that teach kids about online safety and empower them to report abuse.
So there are potential solutions that don't involve creating a backdoor. but they require more nuance, more collaboration, maybe more investment than just demanding tech companies give up the keys to our digital lives.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between security and privacy, protecting individuals, and giving law enforcement the tools they need. It's complicated, but we need to approach it thoughtfully and carefully.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening. It's clear this isn't just about Apple and the UK government. It's about fundamental questions of how we balance security and privacy in our increasingly digital world. It's about power dynamics between governments and tech companies, and the rights and freedoms of everyone who uses the internet.
You got it. This case is about way more than just one company or one country. It's about the future of the internet as we know it.
It feels like a real turning point. Whatever happens in this Apple case in the UK, it could change how we think about digital privacy and security everywhere for years to come.
Absolutely. A pivotal moment. The decisions made now will have a lasting impact.
So let's talk about those impacts. What could happen? If Apple wins, what then? And what if they lose?
If Apple wins, it's a huge victory for privacy. Sends a message that these tech companies are willing to stand up to governments, protect their users' data.
Right.
It could even set a precedent for others to follow, making encryption stronger worldwide.
Sounds like a good outcome for people who value their privacy. But what about the flip side? What if the UK government gets what it wants?
Well, if the government wins, it might encourage other governments to try the same thing. We could see a global push for weaker encryption, with governments claiming they need access to data for fighting crime and terrorism. That would be a major problem for individual privacy and could make the internet itself more vulnerable to attacks.
So no matter what, it's a tough situation. Either we weaken our security by making encryption less effective, or we risk our privacy by giving governments too much power. Is there any way out of this?
It's a tough one, no doubt. But I think the key is to find a more balanced approach, one that recognizes the legitimate security needs of governments, but also protects the right to privacy.
So how do we do that? Any specific solutions or strategies you think could work?
Well, one idea is exceptional access, which we mentioned earlier.
Right.
This means creating a very narrow, strictly controlled way for law enforcement to get encrypted data, but only in very specific extreme cases and with full judicial oversight and transparency.
So instead of a universal backdoor to encryption, it'd be more like a tiny keyhole, used only in rare situations with proper authorization.
Exactly. And even then, the technical part would have to be super strong, super secure to prevent abuse. Not easy, but security experts and policymakers are looking into it.
Sounds like finding that balance between security and privacy needs careful thought, technical know-how, and willingness to compromise from everyone involved. But this whole conversation has shown me how important it is to talk about these things. We need to understand what's at stake and make informed decisions about the future of the internet.
Totally agree. This isn't just a tech issue or a legal issue, it's about society. We need open and honest conversations about the values we want in the digital age. Do we prioritize security over everything else, even if it means losing privacy? Or can we protect both?
And these aren't just theoretical questions. They have real consequences for people. As we've seen, weakening encryption could lead to identity theft, fraud, harassment, even violence. It could also put businesses, governments, and critical infrastructure at risk.
That's why everyone needs to be aware of these issues and get involved in the conversation. We can't just leave it to the tech companies and governments. We all have a stake in the internet's future, and we all need to speak up.
So what can our listeners do? Besides staying informed and talking to friends and family, are there ways they can advocate for the kind of digital world they want?
Definitely. They can support groups fighting for digital privacy and security. They can contact their elected officials and voice their concerns. And they can protect their own data. Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, being careful about what they share online.
All good advice. It's good to know that even though these issues are complex, we can still make a difference. It's not about just passively using technology. It's about actively shaping the digital world we want.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in building a digital future that's secure and respects our rights.
Well, this deep dive has given me a lot to think about. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of encryption to the big picture of government surveillance and what it all means. Fascinating stuff, and a little bit scary at times.
I agree. Complex issue, no easy answers, but we can't ignore it.
As we wrap up, one last thought for our listeners. We don't know how this Apple case in the UK will end, but whatever happens, the debate about encryption, privacy, and security will continue. It's a debate we all need to be part of because the choices we make today will shape the digital world for future generations.
Well said. It's a conversation worth having, and I hope it keeps going.
That's all for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.